Today on This Week in Health IT, we have a great conversation with Micky Tripathi. We're going to cover the past, the present, and the future of interoperability. And Micky is fantastic because he's been there from the beginning and he is leading us into the future. So I really appreciate his insights and look forward to sharing that with you. My name is Bill Russell, former healthcare CIO coach, consultant, and creator of This Week in Health IT, a set of podcasts, videos, and collaboration events dedicated to developing the next generation of health leaders. I want to thank Sirius Healthcare for supporting the mission of our show to develop the next generation of health leaders. Their weekly support has given us the ability to expand our services and develop new offerings for the community. Special thanks to Sirius for that sponsorship. Let's see. Couple just quick bullet points. You guys are taking advantage of the ClipNotes referral program, and keep doing that. Send your friends over to the website, thisweekhealth.com, and have them sign up. Put your name in as the referred by, and you will get signed up for potentially winning a work from home kit from This Week in Health IT. 10 referrals get you this Week in Health IT Moleskin notebook, and whoever gets the most referrals will have the opportunity to sit with me on the Tuesday Newsday show, and that will be fantastic. We'll have a good time. You'll get to take Drex to Ford's spot for a week, and we will have a conversation about the news. So keep those coming. Micky and I talked for about 50 minutes here. This is a little longer than usual. I just want you to know it's worth every minute of your time. So I'm going to get right to the show. Here we go. So today I'm excited. We're going to talk about the history, future, and promise of interoperability with Micky Tripathi, who has really been there from what feels like almost the beginning. Welcome to the show, Micky.
Great, thanks. Really delighted to be here.
I'm reading your bio, and I'll just read it to the group. It has every group and acronym related to interoperability, so we'll establish your credibility pretty quickly here. So you were Micky Tripathi is a pioneer in healthcare interoperability, active in the industry at the local and national level, including memberships of the board of directors of HL7, Sequoia Project, Commonwealth Health Alliance, the Karen Alliance, and the HL7 FHIR Foundation, and the project manager of the Argonaut Project, an industry collaboration to accelerate the adoption of FHIR. He's a former CEO of the, I'm going to say this wrong, Massachusetts EHC, which is Health Collaborative, and recently joined Arcadia as Chief Alliance Officer. That covers everything right there. Karen Alliance, Commonwealth, HL7, FHIR. You've been a part of this for a long time.
I have. I try to help where I can and try not to be spread too thin, which is a challenge.
Yeah, you probably get a lot of phone calls, I would think. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about interoperability, really past and future, since you've been a part of it. Then I'd like to really transition into the promise of why are we doing all this? What's the promise of data and analytics in healthcare? I know for me, and my listeners have heard this before, I came into healthcare in 2011, and the interoperability was hard. Coming from other industries, so my first job in healthcare was in 2011 as a CIO, and we had data quality issues, ontology problems. We had even sitting across from other CIOs saying, hey, we want to share our data through an HIE with you, and having a CIO look at me and say, yeah, we don't want to share our data with you. That was, to me, I was like, man, this is a complicated deal that you don't just solve with technology. There's a lot of different aspects to it. Give us an idea of where you started with this and what progress you've seen, let's just say, over that time frame from when you started.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to. So, yeah, I first got into healthcare IT, really just jumping right into interoperability, where a lot of people enter healthcare and health IT starting like in a provider organization where you're working on all the various systems that are within a hospital, let's say, as you were describing, and then you start to think about how it builds out from there, and that's where you start to confront the interoperability things. I came in a different path, almost sideways, where I was working for a consulting firm at the time, the Boston Consulting Group, and we were hired by a group of organizations in Indianapolis to come and help to do some business modeling and business plan development for what ended up becoming IHI, the Indiana Health Information Exchange. So I spent a lot of time in Indianapolis working with the legendary figures at the Regenstrief Institute, like Clem McDonald and Mark Overhage, working on developing a business plan for taking all the great stuff that the Regenstrief Institute had been doing in interoperability and figuring out a retail, more commercial type of model to help expand that into the community. So I actually started in interoperability and then started working backward into electronic health records. But some of the issues that you had just described in 2011, in 2002, all those issues were there and even worse. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, was that most provider organizations, and certainly in the ambulatory side, didn't have electronic health records, right? It was really just the hospitals. So everything that Indianapolis and the Registry Institute had accomplished had been connecting up the hospital systems across the city. And then you had the wide swath of care that's out in the ambulatory setting, which as we know, is where the vast majority of care happens, was unconnected because no one had electronic health record systems. So that was the first issue that we confronted. All the other issues that you were talking about were definitely there as well. The issues around standards, the issues around curation of data and normalizing data across those systems. None of that's been cured yet, and we can talk about why some of those problems still persist, and some of the competitive issues that you talked about as well. I think that's getting better and better, but over time. But certainly, when we were launching iHi in Indianapolis, one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing is working with the hospitals to get a consensus among them that doing interoperability in the ways that we were talking about with the health information exchange wasn't really competitive. It was more like a joint venture, in the same way that they were pooling money to do joint laundry services. That was the analogy that I like to use. I used to say, you guys are all spending money, pooling your money to get more efficiency out of laundry for all your hospitals. You should be doing that for lab results delivery as well, because it doesn't give you a competitive advantage to have your own provider portal. Physicians actually hate that. They'd rather get everything through one place.
Yeah, and I'm going to really fast forward a lot, and we're going to start talking about 21st century cures, TEFCA, and some other things. But you make the jump to Massachusetts. Does the policy environment and the regulatory environment in Massachusetts make a difference in terms of what you were able to do in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think it was less it wasn't necessarily the policy environment, but it was more the business environment was a little bit different, which allowed the creation of the Massachusetts Health Collaborative and working with a number of other organizations who had already been in the state. So one part of it was certainly that for whatever reason in Massachusetts, there had been a lot of collaboration already. That you had organizations like the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium that was founded in the late 1990s, and they had launched a health information exchange called NEHIN, the New England Health Exchange Network. And that was up and running came right after the passage of HIPAA, where a group of very leading CIOs like John Glasser, who was the CIO of Partners, and John Lamka, who's a CIO of Beth Israel, and a couple of others, got together and said, hey, we should, before we all spend money on this new HIPAA set of transactions that all of us know we have to do, why don't we get together and do this together? So you had that, that climate where people had developed that trust from something that was successful, which I think is really important. But another really important thing that I think makes every market different in Massachusetts is you've got this, I think of it as game theory, which is you got the providers, ambulatory providers, let's say, and you've got the government, and you've got healthcare payers, and you have the payers. And in each market, there's differences in the relative power of each of those groups, I think, when you think about it. And when you look at it market by market, it's really different. Massachusetts, because it's so concentrated among the payers, it's really 3 or 4 nonprofit payers who are Massachusetts-based who account for 98% of the covered lives in the state. And that's a very different dynamic than like in Indianapolis, where it was something like 10 national commercial payers who accounted for 50% of the covered lives, and then the rest was like a long tail, right? So in Massachusetts, you're able to get 3 or 4 payers together and agreed they're going to do something, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of the market sort of captured. And that's what happened with the Mass Health Collaborative. The Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts agreed to put some money forward to run a large-scale health IT experiment that would be community-based. And and it didn't take that much effort after that to get a lot of the market together to be able to agree to move forward on something like this.
Yeah, so it feels like, I've referred to this as the starting line, and that might be a little offensive to someone like you who's been doing this for 20 some odd years. But 21st century cures really, it maybe not the starting line, but it really does set the foundation to change how we do this on a national level and really on a local level, but nationally really address this problem. And part of that is TEFCA, and part of that is RCEs and USCDA. And I want to walk through that acronym soup with you.
Sure.
So let's start with 21st Century Cures and TEFCA. Why is 21st Century Cures important, and what is TEFCA?
Sure. Yeah. So 21st Century Cures was passed, just to give perspective to everyone who's listening. That was passed at the end of the Obama administration, which I know feels like about 5 generations ago. But that law, a lot of people confuse it with the CARES Act, which of course was to address COVID. The 21st Century Cures Act was passed at the very end of the Obama administration, and it's only now coming into force because it took that long for the rules to come out. But now that the rules are out, what's important about 21st Century Cures, I think of 3 things as being really important. One is TEFCA, as you pointed out. TEFCA is the Trusted Exchange Framework and Cooperative Agreement, I think is what it's called. And that is the creation of a nationwide framework for interoperability with a governance mechanism and an approach to managing interoperability at a nationwide level, bringing the networks together under a single governance framework. So that's work that's underway. The RCE that you referred to is called the Recognized Coordinating Entity, which is supposed to be the organization that plays that governance role. That's supposed to be the forum for having these networks. Let's say, we don't know how many networks, but that'll define the standards, that'll define the policies, working closely with the federal government to define what are the rules of the road of nationwide interoperability and how would we think about that. That's what the Sequoia project is, the RCE right now, and they're hard at work working with the federal government as well as with key stakeholders to develop that framework and develop that first set of rules of the road to be able to launch that. Obviously, COVID has slowed things down a little bit, and I think one of the interesting features of TEFCA is that it's not required. There's nothing that requires that anyone participate in TEFCA. So that'll be a little bit of the experiment here for us to figure out how valuable is TEFCA to people, because it's not like meaningful use. It's not like the information blocking rule. There is nothing in the law that says you must connect to TEFCA. There's nothing about payment that says you must be connected to a TEFCA, health information exchange in order to get paid. So that'll be an interesting thing that's going on. We hope that'll, have a number of large participants, network participants like Commonwealth and Care Equality who will join that and become a part of those networks. But it's really an open question of, is that going to be something that accelerates interoperability, or is that already happening on its own and TEFCA is a nice overlay but isn't necessary to accelerate the market? The other parts of 21st Century Cures that I think are really important are information blocking. So the information blocking law that basically said to providers and to vendors, to EHR vendors, that your default should be to share information, assuming that it's happening under appropriate permissions related to HIPAA and any other regulatory constraints that might exist in the market. But subject to those, that the default should be that you're sharing information. And it identified a certain number, I think it was 7 exceptions that you could claim for not sharing information if it's being requested by another authorized party. But that really flips a little bit of the conversation. As you were describing with your experience with St. Joe's, it was asking to share information with another organization and they say, no, I don't want to do it. Now that kind of flips the equation to say they have to have a reason essentially to say why they wouldn't do it, where the answer should be yes right away. And so information blocking is really important. It's important for the providers as well as importantly for the EHR vendors, because there's real penalties associated with it that could be enforced. So that's a really important part of this. It's a policy framework that applies nationwide. There is a draft rule right now that's about to be released. It could get released actually today or tomorrow that could delay the deadlines for information blocking, which I think would be disheartening to some of us. But on the other hand, we are in a national crisis, I think, a global crisis. So I think it's certainly fair to think that in a global crisis, it probably makes sense to give a little bit more time to some of these things, given that provider organizations in particular have a lot of other things that they're trying to focus on right now. The last important piece of 21st Century Cures, and then I'll pause, I promise, is the requirement. What flowed from that is the requirement that we use FHIR RESTful APIs, in particular, a particular version of FHIR, an interoperability standard that we can certainly talk about more, as the basis for these interoperability paradigms that that are going to be a part of the future. So up until that point, there had been no requirements for what would constitute a requirement for interoperability on a nationwide level, and in particular for the use of RESTful APIs or a specification for a RESTful API. And what flowed from 21st Century Cures was the most recent ONC rule that said that in order to fulfill the requirements of this law, you actually have to implement a specific version of FHIR so that we have as close to standardization of API-based exchange across the industry as possible. The other dimension that flowed from that was CMS extending it to payers. Payers had never been a part of this. And as you start to think about the importance of saying that payers should be making data available and interoperating in the same manner that providers have been required to, is really an important part of extending the ecosystem, the interoperability ecosystem, out to another critical part of the healthcare delivery system.
And which version of FHIR did we end up at? 4? Or which?
Yeah, it's a specific implementation guide for R4. Yeah, so R4 is what's required. It was a particular implementation guide that's called the US Core. It's a US Core implementation guide, STU, blah, 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 blah. You can find it in the rule, but it was a version that was passed just this past September. And that is the rule that, or is the specification that's required to be implemented, both by providers as well as payers.
That's a great foundation for the 21st Century Cures Act. I get questions from time to time. Hey, this USCDA thing over here, is that a part of 21st Century Cures? What part is that going to play in interoperability?
So the USCDI is a really important part. So the USCDI is the evolution of what used to be called the CCDS, just to throw another acronym in the mix, which was the Common Clinical Data Set. So the Common Clinical Data Set got defined as a part of the Meaningful Use program. And it was basically, what was being said at the time was there was a certain amount of information that we want to have captured in these CCDs that are required to be made available to providers in provider-to-provider exchange. Let's say as a part of a referral, a referral transition of care, for example. And that begged the question of, all right, I've got a CCD, which is just an XML document. What am I required to put in there? Is there, like a minimum set of data? And the answer to that is yes. It was called the Common Clinical Data Set. And it was about 21, 22 data elements that if you and I, Bill, sat down naively and without any background in informatics and said, what are the things that we think most doctors would want to have in front of them for that next patient who's walking in? We would, on our own, come up with 95% of the CCDS. It's very intuitive, right? It's allergies, meds, problems, right? Very common kinds of things that are contained in the Common Clinical Data Set. So when the new rule, the new administration came in and issued the new rule, they basically renamed the CCDS the USCDI, which is the US Core Data for Interoperability. But it's the exact same concept. It basically said it's a core set of data that's required to be made available now through a FHIR API, so that when I request data through a FHIR API from provider A, from Mass General Hospital, or St. Joseph's, or from Cleveland Clinic, I will have the same expectation that what I get back will be at a minimum the USCDI. So I can at least count on that. And then each of them may add more on top of that, but it's the common denominator that's required of every API to be able to make that available.
Are we getting discrete data elements at that point?
Yes. Yep. And actually we are, I think one thing for us to just, and this is a little bit of a subtlety of interoperability, but that's what this podcast is about, right? Not just the superficial, but but the deep understanding, is that even with CCDs, which are required to be exchanged for certain transitions of care under meaningful use and then promoting interoperability, those were discrete data elements as well. In a continuity of care document, the beauty of an XML document is that it's human readable as narrative, or that it can be rendered as human readable, but it actually has the structured data in each of those sections. The problem with it is that it's really clunky, and you get that whole document every single time. So you might just want labs, but you have to get the whole document in order to get the labs. And some of those XML documents can, if you were going to paginate them, could be dozens of pages long, and you're thinking, all I want was the labs. That's it. I didn't want all this other stuff. So it's really clunky, and it also was a real bear, which one of the things we can talk about is how does this innovate, the industry, is that if you're outside the industry, you don't want to be dealing with these weird XML documents, right? You want to be dealing with discrete data elements. So the data elements were always there, but in a very unwieldy and clunky form that really was a barrier to better and richer and cleaner interoperability. The beauty of the FHIR API is that it does allow that data element of interoperability for me to just say, I just want the allergies, don't send me anything else.
Yeah, we're going to go in a lot of those directions. I jokingly refer to this as, we could rename this podcast tomorrow as the education of Bill Russell. So my job is to ask some questions that just might appear like I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm really okay with that because with every podcast, I get a little smarter. USCDI, so that's the core clinical data set. Is the government going to keep expanding that, or do we anticipate that health systems will come together like they did in Massachusetts, start to define other data sets around oncology and other things, or will those all end up becoming a part of USCDI?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer to that is actually both. So the government is planning on expanding the USCDI. So the idea of the USCDI is that it is it's a concept, and it will continue to grow over time. So we start off with the USCDI is this set of data elements, which were derived directly from the CCDS, the Common Clinical Data Set, and that over time, as we get more and more maturity and the industry has more and more demands in terms of the kind of data they want to have interoperable, the federal government, through a standards development process, will add to the USCDI. So the idea is, let's not do that overnight, because there's a whole bunch of data that's not really mature enough right now to be made available in standards-based ways. But as we push from an industry perspective to make that data better and more standardized, that at the point of maturity of those, then ONC would say, all right, for the next version 2 of the USCDI, it will now include these additional elements. And the idea is that will continue to grow. And just to give you an example of how important that is, first thing to note is that the Common Clinical Data Set was defined back in 2012, something like that, as a part of meaningful use. It has not changed meaningfully since then. So here we are 7-8 years later, and it just got renamed the CCDS to the USCDI, but it's only in this version of the USCDI that it's changed. So it's up from 2012 to 2019 or 2020, let's say, it actually didn't change. And you think about that, it's like, wow, that's really, it's kind of very static. So the idea is, no, let's make this more dynamic. We need to add more and more things to this. So now clinical notes are now included, for example, which is a really important data. And there are other data that now got added to the USCDI, but that's the first upgrade to it. So that just shows that it's been very static for a while, and we really want to make it more as a growing thing. The second thing is that right now it's just clinical data that's contained in there. So there's no administrative or claims or payer related data in the USCDI. So you talk about exchanging information, anything that that a payer would care about, like claims-based data, eligibility data, benefits data, explanation of benefits data for patients, payment. None of those things are in the USCDI right now. So even as we think about these FHIR APIs, it's like, oh, there's a whole bunch of data that actually isn't included in that right now because it's so clinically focused.
So payers are being required to share their data. Is that part of 21st Century Cures, or is that?
So it's derivative of 21st Century Cures. So 21st Century Cures Act, the law itself didn't require that, but CMS, as they were looking at ONC creating the rule to implement 21st Century Cures, CMS really decided, I think, and it was a great decision and something that was really beneficial to the industry, just said, you know what, we're going to lean way forward into this. And we're going to say that as a part of the regulatory authority that we have over any health plan that's regulated by CMS, which is not just Medicare and Medicaid, it's commercial plans that are a part of the ACA exchanges in every single state. And that starts to cover a whole bunch of health plans and a whole bunch of the market. They basically said, we're going to require that you abide by these rules that came out of 21st Century Cures, because interoperability doesn't work if it's just the providers. the payers should be required to do this too. So it wasn't explicitly required by 21st Century Cures, but through rulemaking, CMS basically put it under that umbrella and said, we're going to write a rule that says that the payers need to abide by the principles and the concepts of what's in 21st Century Cures.
So have we seen groups self-organize, or is there an example of that yet? Or are we hopeful that's going to happen? And where will that happen? Will that happen with maybe an academic medical center taking the lead, or will that happen with industry organizations taking the lead?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's actually all of the above. It's already happened, and you named some of those organizations when you were doing the intro. So the Argonaut Project, the Karen Alliance, Codex, Gravity, let's see, the Da Vinci Project, and a number of others are what are now being called FHIR accelerators. So these are, the first one was the Argonaut Project, which formed in late 2014. And the idea of that was as we were looking out, then looking at FHIR starting to get a lot of attention, and the very high probability that the National Coordinator's Office would make FHIR and RESTful APIs a part of a certification requirement. A group of EHR vendors and large providers got together and said, we should act ourselves without waiting for the government to try to get some market input into accelerating these standards to make them as ready as possible once they reach the point of being required by regulation. So let's try to accelerate that and make that stuff more mature so that it's ready for prime time once it becomes ready, a part of regulation. And that was really focused on a group of stakeholders who were like a coalition of the willing around a certain set of things. And it was focused on clinical care and provider-to-provider exchange or provider-to-patient exchange, but basically like electronic health records and what's in electronic health records. That ended up becoming pretty successful. That led to the creation of the requirements that are now in regulation for the use of APIs and the use of FHIR, and led to, for example, the specification that's in the Apple Health Record is based on the Argonaut Project specification that got created out of that. But one of the things that we recognized as we were starting to reflect on the Argonaut Project was that not only the output of what we did was important, but it was actually the forum, the approach that we took, that this was really just something that we noticed it wasn't as if we had all this in mind at the beginning. It was more just people getting together saying, hey, let's take the next step and do some stuff. But we recognized that, this market-based thing is really important. And one of the things that's really important is just having focus around something that you really want to do. And so that led to like the Da Vinci Project moving forward, where you had a group of payers who said, we're really interested in payer-oriented use cases. And we want to focus on that part of FHIR that's really important for payers, and get together and collaborate among competitors, getting together and saying, let's collaborate around these standards to help move everyone forward. And so the Da Vinci Project then came, and then the Karen Alliance. So Da Vinci is focused on payer type exchange. The Karen Alliance focused on commercial payers and patient access from payers first and foremost, but patient access generally. And then you have the Gravity Project, which is focused on social determinants of health. You have Codex, which is focused on cancer data. Just as you're describing, there are a lot of these communities that are now forming, all with an eye towards saying, I want to accelerate this part of the FHIR world so that I can make it mature faster, ultimately, not only for this purpose, but ultimately with one part of the goal being that ONC would say, that cancer data is now mature enough and standardized enough that we'll make that a part of the USCDI now. And so you start to get that feeds into a process where the USCDI starts to expand faster than it would otherwise, because you have this market-based organic activity helping to accelerate things that people find are important in the market.
I was in some of those rooms early on where, Anish would grab you, or Halamka would grab you and say, hey, come to this session. It would be in a side room for HIMSS, and they'd be talking about FHIR and where this thing's going and whatnot. But that wouldn't be the case today. The FHIR has an awful lot of legs, and it even had it before 21st Century Cures. A lot of people were seeing the promise of it. And so I want to talk about two aspects. One is, do we anticipate this is the foundation for really a renaissance in digital health, that we're going to open up this data to this world of developers and in collaboration with health providers and even payers, and just see a whole new set of applications? That's the promise of it, right? And do we anticipate that happening?
Yeah, I think it's already happening, and I think it's going to really start, happening in exponential ways as we, start to see that ecosystem start to form. And I guess it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, FHIR is just a standard, right? So you would say it's just a standard, and we had HL7V2, and then we had CCDs.
Well,
how could just a technical?
Because my alternative is I have to go through this app store, and I have to pay significant amounts of money. It's challenging, it's difficult, it's costly.
Right.
So
right. Yeah, and so you ask yourself, how could a technical standard, when as you and I discussed before, this isn't a technical problem, right? It never was a technical problem. It's all about business and all of the issues related to business and about the socioeconomic climate of healthcare, not about the technical standards or lack of technical standards. But the reason I think that FHIR itself actually is really important, and we're starting to see that, is a couple of things. One is that it's really democratizing in a way, because it is much more aligned with the way that the rest of the internet economy works. And so you don't have as I was describing before, developers, most of whom live outside of healthcare, right? As much as we like to think healthcare is the fulcrum of the universe, most of the internet and most developers live outside of healthcare. And any of them who looked at healthcare and thought about making a step or two into healthcare, like Google Health early on, they had the patient portal at Google Health, and one of the things, and then Microsoft Health Vault a little bit later, and one of the things they discovered in trying to work with CCDs, which were the state of the art, was, oh man, those are just like painful. That is just, it's healthcare specific, it's 1980s sort of technology, and I cannot get my new Stanford or MIT grad to agree to study a 1,000-page implementation guide of an XML standard, and they're just not going to do that. There's no way in the world they're going to do that. And so they just stayed out, right? They stayed outside on the periphery. And I think if we've learned nothing else from the internet, crowdsourcing is everything, right? The more eyeballs and the more people you have working on stuff, the greater the odds that really cool things are going to come of it. And so it's democratizing in that way, and that RESTful APIs are the way the rest of the internet economy works, and it opens it up in that way. I think the other thing that's really important is that because of the data element of transaction that we're talking about, it allows for really refined and rich applications that can be really targeted at things that, that drive people's lives. An app that is just focused on your allergies with whatever other comorbidities you have, right? And being able to, a developer to be able to create that kind of app that just tries to get that data. Any developer who was stuck in a world where they would have to get a CCD every time and sift through 20 million lines of XML code and all this other extraneous data that they didn't want in order to be able to make that app work, would say, I'm not going to do that. There's no way that I can make that app work. But if you tell them that there's a FHIR API on the other end of it, and you can just get the data you need to have your app work, I think that is enticing to people, and is a part of that flourishing of that app economy that we're just at the at the threshold of now.
So let's see, how do I say this? The arguments against the final rule had things in it. Had people saying things like, what about the Chinese hacker app, which is you're going to get me or my parents to download it. They're going to get access to my medical record, those kind of things. So there's that aspect. The other aspect was, hey, we just moved it from a HIPAA compliant data store to Apple, which is technically not under HIPAA. And so that data store's outside of it. Are those arguments falling by the wayside, or have they been addressed?
Neither. Those are really big issues, and just to put a fine point on what you just said, because it's a great question. It's a really important question. Is when patients start to access the data on their own. See, the Apple Health Record, for example. One thing that now I think, just to be fair to Apple does a fantastic job of making sure that patients understand what's going on, right? But they do that as a part of Apple policy, not because the law requires them to. And there are lots of other actors out there who may not be as good actors as Apple has been.
Apple has staked their claim on secure, so that's their that's
part of their brand now, right?
Brand.
Even they don't have access to the information. So Apple literally couldn't tell you, if you ask Apple the question, how many patients have downloaded their medical records onto their onto the iPhone, they actually literally can't answer that question because they're not a part of that transaction, right? It's all between the device and through the API, and it doesn't go through that central infrastructure quite in the same way. But the point is that the minute that I, as a patient, download that information myself, it's now no longer covered by HIPAA or no longer protected by HIPAA. And that's really confusing to 99.9% of people in the country. They think that HIPAA protects medical data, right? Of course it does. But HIPAA doesn't protect medical data. HIPAA only protects the data that a provider has or a payer has when it's in their, when they're in control of it. And it covers their release of the data. But once it's in your hands as a patient, if someone else hacks in or you make the data available, one nightmare scenario is you get the data onto your phone, unbeknownst to you, you think it's covered, it's not. And the data is now sitting there on your phone. And let's say a recruiting app, you download a recruiting app as well. You're looking for a job, right? And you download a recruiting app. And the recruiting app notices on the back end that, hey, you have medical record data on your phone. Would you like to make some of that data available to the recruiting app to demonstrate your productivity potential to new employers? And somehow it extracts information about some chronic condition that you have. And all of a sudden you're not getting any requests for your resume and you don't know why. HIPAA doesn't protect that. There is no protection actually in the US. GDPR in Europe protects that, but in the US there is no protection against that. And I'm going to guess that the vast majority of patients have no idea that that's the kind of risk that they could face if they aren't really careful about their data. Now that's a nightmare scenario, but that's absolutely, we trade as individuals, we trade our security, our privacy for convenience all the time, right? That's what we do. Every time we do a search, we either know or we kind of know, but we pretend we don't, that, oh, I've actually got a beacon on my head as I go through the internet, and Google knows it and all these other places know it, but damn, I really want to buy that patio heater. So I'm going to trade that off for the convenience of just being able to order it and have it delivered to my door. In the same way, you could imagine that OpenTable, I'm not saying OpenTable is doing this, but what would stop someone from thinking about the great convenience if I had celiac disease or if I had real food allergies, being able to say, hey, I would love to upload that part of my medical record or give access to OpenTable so that when I make a reservation, they tell the restaurant that, hey, this person has celiac disease, right? People do those kinds of convenience trade-offs all the time. It's like, oh, now all of a sudden you've just allowed your medical record information to be made available over the internet with no protections. That's that kind of concern people have. Just the last point, the CARIN Alliance is working on and has created a code of conduct, an industry code of conduct, that the idea would be that, well, there's no regulation that steps in right now and protects that information outside of the walls of HIPAA, but maybe there's an industry code of conduct that, that we can get companies to sign that at least will, have them in a non-binding way, but publicly committing to the protection of data that's made available in their app. And that's at least one step to try to close that gap.
Well, and this is the brilliance of Apple's strategy, right? So every time something tries to access the camera or access the microphone or the medical record, I guess, you would get that alert and you'd be able to see that. And they might even have I know in the case of the camera, there's a little circular thing that shows up if an app is actually accessing your camera at a certain time. And so that's the brilliance of their strategy is to know who's accessing that. But again, that's not 100% of market share. In fact, that's only 60% of market share in the US. And globally, obviously, Android has more market share. And I'm not sure, because I'm not an Android user, I'm not sure what their protections are against that kind of stuff. But I think my hope is that we're going to see an ecosystem sort of evolve that puts a bubble around that information, lets us know when we're sharing it, lets us know what pieces we're actually sharing. And I guess that's the code of conduct. And maybe we'll see a GDPR kind of thing in the US. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either, but that is a big gap, and it's a real concern that has been a concern for a few years now.
So you moved to Arcadia. Tell us about that move. What does Arcadia do?
Yeah, so Arcadia is a population health management and value-based care technology vendor. So what we do is we do analytics and other applications to support provider organizations, accountable care organizations, payers, and others who are in value-based care, who are trying to do everything they can to move to more value-based purchasing types of approaches of healthcare and to provide the foundation, the analytic foundation and the application foundation for them to be able to do that. So being able to take in clinical and claims data, analyze that patient data to be able to identify who's at risk, what are the risk stratifications, how do we measure quality in a better way, how do we identify where there are gaps in care, and how do we then deliver applications to those people on the front line, like care managers, who can then reach out to patients and help them come in and get the care they need to be able to fill those gaps in care. So end-to-end product to take data in and then deliver applications to the people at the front lines who make those kinds of interventions.
So are those applications like just a set of tools like R and that kind of stuff, or is it like a packaged set of reports and analytics tools?
Yeah, it's both of those. So we have a couple of different ways that people can consume that information. So we have something, as you suggest, like R, but we have a product called Foundry, which basically allows a provider, it makes their data available to them so they can use whatever tools they want, SQL or whatever, their own data to be able to do any kinds of analyses that they want to do with data marts that we create for them from their data. So they can do that if they want. If they have a lot of our more advanced customers will do that. They have their own data scientists who want to come in and just wade through the data, which is fine. We also have reports that we can publish on their behalf through a product called Bindery that basically will allow them to define the set of reports that they want to be able to deliver to their providers that show how their providers are doing on different dimensions of care and different dimensions of quality and performance, and to be able to distribute those to them in a static form that they can at least say, okay, here's my last quarter report. I can see how I did against all these measures. I can do benchmarking, all of that. And we also have just interactive user interfaces that people can come in and dynamically look at data. So they can, look at through applications, they can look at their quality measures. There's also a care management suite that allows them to come in and look at risk stratifications, look at patients who create cohorts of patients based on criteria that they'll define, or they can use the ones that we have predefined, and then be able to say, all right, here are the high risk patients for certain types of risk that I define, and now let me generate campaigns. For example, they can either have care managers on their own go out and do that work, or in addition to that, they could generate campaigns to say, here are the 353 patients who I know need a flu vaccine in the next 3 months. Let me, with the push of a button, send out an email to all 353 of those to generate that campaign to try to bring them into the offices. So it's got that full end-to-end capability with a wide variety of ways for them to be able to access data. And then increasingly what we're doing is moving that to a platform so that people can actually bring their own applications to it. So they don't have to use our applications. They can, through a FHIR API or a set of FHIR APIs, say, hey, I love the way you curate data for me and the other value add that you bring in, but I have my own applications that I'd like to use. I don't want to be stuck with yours. So we have FHIR APIs that allow them to do that as well.
It's interesting. A lot of this stuff wouldn't even be possible without the interoperability work you did before. I assume you guys you're probably using HL7. You're probably scooping whole data sets, as I would imagine. You're probably using FHIR. You're probably using anything at your disposal to aggregate that data. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah. That's a great intuition that you have, and it's absolutely right. Customer experience as a CIO, you can't say, I'm just doing HL7. It's like the world is a messy place. So yeah, we have a complete portfolio of a whole bunch of proprietary connectors that we use for places where if you have direct access to the data, to the database, like if it's an on-premise EHR, for example, we can just connect it up with on the back end with like an ODPC or SQL extract kind of software agent that can just pull the data out. That's easy and fast. But increasingly, with more and more cloud hosting of systems, provider, him or herself, doesn't have direct access to or can't provide direct access to their EHR. And as standards get better, we're able to say, oh, now we're in a place where HL7v2, CCDs, and increasingly FHIR will be approaches that can get us more and more of that data. Part of the challenge of that, as we alluded to before with the USCDI, is that as you think about all the needs that are required for population health and value-based care, there are some types of data that aren't a part of the USCDI, but that are really important to be able to do appropriate care. For example, scheduling data. It's hugely important, right? If I know that a patient is coming in next week and I know that patient has 2 gaps in care, you can imagine the importance of that to a care manager to be able to say, get to that provider and make sure they know that when that patient comes in, hit them up with, do you want a flu vaccine? And do you want whatever else they're missing? Scheduling data is not a part of the USCDI. So how do we get that additional data out of those systems? Often it requires separate types of approaches, HL7v2, or even proprietary approaches or flat files if we have to. We just have to be very mercenary and try to do it in whatever way we can.
Chief Alliance Officer, what exactly is that?
I negotiate treaties like Yalta, and it's me and Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin sitting at a table. No, I work on partnerships, on strategic partnerships in particular. We have a great growth team that works on what you would think a growth team works on, which is sales. And we have a great strategy team that works on the company strategy. And somewhere in the gray area, there are things that aren't about a direct sale and that aren't pure strategy that we do internally, but that are strategic partners, relationships that we want to have with other organizations that are about long-term mutual shared benefit for a set of things that we can go to market together with. And so that's what I work on. And part of that is with other companies, like we just announced a partnership with Patient Ping, for example, and with Algorex, and we have an ongoing partnership with AWS because we're a big AWS user. So we have a number of those things, and when we're growing those. And then, but it's also the connection to those national level activities that you described before, being able to maintain a presence in those national forums like the Sequoia Project, like HL7, to be able to bring that to Arcadia, but also help to bring Arcadia's experience to help better help inform what's going on at the national policy level based on the ground experience that we have.
Micky, I want to thank you for your time. This is a phenomenal episode. I will probably go back and listen to it a couple of times. We covered so much ground and so much of what is going on today. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. Is there a way for if people wanted to follow the things you're doing and those kind of things? Are you active on social media or other places?
I am, yeah. So I am on Twitter at Micky Tripathi1, I think is my handle. And certainly people should feel free to reach out to me directly, micky.tripathi@arcadia.io. And I occasionally blog on the His Talk site and in other places as well. So very much look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone. And you really appreciate your time, Bill. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been fantastic. That's all for this week. Micky was fantastic. I hope you appreciated that show. Don't forget to sign up for Clip Notes, send an email, hit the website. We want to make you and your system more productive. Special thanks to our channel sponsors, VMware, Starbridge Advisors, Galen Healthcare, HealthLyrics, Sirius Healthcare, ProTalent Advisors, Health Next, and McAfee for choosing to invest in developing the next generation of health leaders. This show is a production of This Week in Health IT. For more great content, check out the website, thisweekhealth.com, or the YouTube channel. If you want to support the show, best way to do that, sign up for Clip Notes. Participate in the referral program, send it out to your peers and let them know that you're getting value out of the show. Please check back every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday for more shows. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.